Welcome to ChefConf sessions. Thanks for coming to this one. This is something that is really near and dear to my heart right now, and I really wanted us at ChefConf to have a conversation about it. And I'm glad to see that you guys want to have that same conversation. Anybody this morning do any running? There's a couple. Anybody do yoga? I was at yoga. No yogas? Yogi, I guess is what you call it. Anybody from Texas in the room? Nobody from Texas? Do I not see any hands? Okay, so I'm from Texas, right? And I'm from Dallas, Texas. And right now I have my talk to people who aren't from Texas voice on. And I learned this from my mom. And my mom has spent the last 20 or 30 years as a triage nurse for a hospice. So and she works overnight. So she works all through the night talking to people who are terminally ill and near death to get them help. And her phone manners are absolutely impeccable until she gets family on the line. So here's her workflow for people who are normal, non-Texans like you guys. It's hello. Yeah, Michael, come and okay. That's your typical, phone etiquette. But when her sister calls her, she starts out the same way because she doesn't know. Before caller ID, this was all my childhood. So she starts at hello, and then it goes into, so what are you doing? Well, I thought that they wouldn't do that. That kind of thing. She goes into total country mode because she grew up on a farm in Central Texas, and we in Texas like to talk to each other in a certain way that's different than we talk to non-Texans, unless we're running for president, and then we totally pour on the Texas stuff because we think we're a cowboy now, right? So I don't think George Bush really talks like that normally. He has a Harvard MBA, but when he's running for president or when he's running the Texas Rangers baseball, he'll talk like a Texan, right? So why am I talking about this? Databases are kind of the same way. We go out to ChefConf, we get all excited about the cool things everybody's doing, and then we go back to our own environments, and we have our own way of talking to each other about our own thing, and we think it only applies to us, and we think that the databases are sort of this special breed of thing that's hard, and so we don't like to talk about it. And I realized this in the last few months, and I thought that, there's probably some more discussion that we can have where it's not just, talking with the family at work, but it's talking in a community about databases. And so my goal here today is to start that conversation. I don't think in 40 minutes I can cover everything about databases. In fact, I think if I were to talk to a few of you, or most of you, you guys would probably be able to teach me a lot about what you're doing with databases. But I think it's important to start the conversation and to lay a foundation for what kinds of issues you're going to talk about and some of the approaches that you'll make with those issues. So I'm Michael Hedgpeth. I'm from NCR. We're basically going to talk about 4 things today. We're going to talk about, I'm going to give you some context about my business so you can understand where I come from. We're going to talk about the different problems with databases and some of the things that Chef is more amenable to and some of the things that we sort of ignore because other tools are available. And I'm going to get into an example, especially with schema management. So I'll give you an example that I've put on GitHub and the Chef Supermarket for how you would do schema management in a chef-friendly way to put some meat on the bones, as they say. And then I'm going to finish up with talking about strategy. How do you get DBA people to be on your side with this whole DevOps thing that you're trying to do? So about us, NCR, 130 years ago, invented the cash register. So that was totally awesome for most of the 20th century because we basically revolutionized retail. And hardware was obviously our focus in the 20th century. In the latter part of the 20th century, we got into ATMs and did a lot of banking type of things. And we realized 10 or 15 years ago that hardware wasn't going to cut it, and we needed to be what we call a software-driven or hardware-driven software company, basically, where we use our hardware as a platform to get our software out, but we believe that software is our future, and we're building that future with Chef. I work in hospitality. That's a fancy term for restaurants, as far as we're concerned right now. So we work in table service, quick service, casual, any type of restaurant you can think of. We have a majority of the market share in the United States in the restaurant space. Our biggest challenge, this is not anything to do with the database talk, but just something that's interesting for us. How do you keep a system running when somebody can spill a soda on a main component of it? Or when someone has a fryer and you're trying to time the fryer or manage a workflow through a restaurant, and you have grease going up into the hardware and doing crazy things. So how do you keep a redundant architecture within a restaurant, and how do you securely flow that data outside into the cloud so that you can report on it for larger organizations? That's our biggest problem, and it's not solved by writing a client-server database application. But especially when you get out of the restaurant, you get into the cloud, databases form a huge part of our infrastructure. We have thousands of databases, hundreds of servers with thousands of databases, mostly a SQL Server environment, although we're using PostgreSQL as well. About me, anybody remember 2008? Specifically October 2008? The world was ending in 2008, specifically October 2008. We did not know if there was going to be an economy anymore. We did not know if we would all be alive the next year. There was a lot of panic in the air. And my business decided strategically they asked me to focus on automation, continuous integration, mainly of our flagship point-of-sale software. And for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working on that, and we've made a lot of gains on it. We've increased the speed that we are able to see whether our software is working. But I kept running into a wall over and over again. I wasn't getting the results that I wanted to get. And we thought about it, and we realized that, in any system, the slowest part of the system is going to slow the whole system down. It doesn't matter how good you are at building, how good you are at telling people that the software is working. If you're not good at delivering, then you are going to still be slow. And so we've focused our attention outside of automation and continuous integration into the deployment and delivery space, which is where Chef comes in with our hosted products. That's my blog, hedge-ops.com, if you want to go visit me. And also throw a shout out to my wife. She did this slide presentation. She has an art degree and is a photographer. So these are all her pictures. Hope you enjoy them. Except for that picture is not her picture. So I want to talk about, in 2014, we decided that we wanted to automate our delivery, just like many of you, inside of our data center. And so we partnered with Chef to do that. And when we decided to engage with them, I met with one of the leaders in our operations group named Daniel. And Daniel is on one of our flagship hosted products. And this is the one that I was telling you about that has 500, 600 servers, thousands of SQL Server databases. It's a giant ball of data for data that's years and years old. And he's a SQL Server guy. He's a DBA. He knows everything there is to know about the infrastructure. So as you can imagine, when I started mentioning Chef, he immediately went to databases. He said, so we're not going to, he's in our operations leadership, he said, we're not going to go to a tool unless it's going to work for the databases as well. That would be stupid. And I said, well, that's a good point. Databases is a big part of our business. It's probably a big part of yours. So I went to Chef, the Chef sales organization, which is a fabulous organization and is the reason I'm here, by the way. And they said, I said, so what about the databases? What can I read? What can I look at? And they said, well, everybody's a snowflake. And I understand what that means now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But at the time, everybody's a snowflake was sort of, I sort of took that as we don't really know, or go solve your own problem, or figure it out. We don't, there was just not a lot of comfort in that. It was almost like I was Karate Kid, and they were telling me to go like paint the roof or up and down, and soon I was going to learn some karate moves. So, did I just date myself with the Karate Kid thing? Yeah? Okay. They came out with a new Karate Kid. Okay, yeah, where the kid like went and beat him up in China. Yeah, okay, yeah. Just wanted to check that. That should have been like a preparation thing. So it felt kind of like Karate Kid, like wax up, wax down, answer, how do we deal with databases? Snowflakes, Daniel's son. And I realized that after going on my journey with figuring out the databases, that it's a little bit simpler than snowflakes, that we can really talk about this, that we can share our experiences and have a conversation about it. And I found that it's a pretty easy conversation to have. Chef is really compatible with databases from the way that we're approaching them. There are some difficult problems. There are problems that are more difficult in databases than other places, but it's not just this, wasteland of you can't do it stuff. That doesn't make much sense. But you have to when you're using when we're looking at databases, this is an approachable problem for everybody, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we're talking to database people, we are generally talking about four things. So Daniel's talking to me about installing databases. How are we going to do image management? He's talking about backup and restore, talking about schema management and configuration. Those are the main areas that you're talking about. So we're going to break these up. Some of these are better for Chef. Some of these aren't better for Chef as you're starting out. So I think every Chef has a role in all of these things. But you kind of take the approach of let's do the easier stuff first. Let's get all the good pieces first, and we'll worry about the rest later. So installing databases. This is where we're talking about how do I get SQL Server on the machine from an image, and this is really an image management issue. For us, we already have automated processes for image management. We use VMware. We do the stuff with VMware. So for us, installing databases wasn't really a need or an issue, not something that we're focused on. Backup and restore, we use Redgate backup for our backup and restore. We have no need for some other backup and restore process. So backup and restore is already a problem that's automated and solved for us, not something that we're going to really focus on. It's something that could be integrated with Chef and make some cool things, like how do you add another node, but it's not something that really is the first, as you're going into databases, it's the first thing you're focused on. This, however, is a big focus. How do you manage the schema? So when you're doing an upgrade, how do you add a table or add a column or do something to the schema? Because you're probably going to do that along with an application upgrade. So this is the main focus of the presentation and the main thing to focus on when we're doing our Chef initiative with databases. Then finally, database configuration. This is a pretty limited area, but it's basically like when I'm running my database, I want to run with this amount of memory. or I need to have these things turned on. This is a natural thing with Chef, and something that we will kind of touch on in the presentation, but from my experience within my organization of dozens of teams and their database applications, this isn't a huge need or a huge deal for us. All right, so we're going to talk a majority of the presentation, or the rest of the presentation, about schema management. So when you do a Chef initiative with a database application, you have to manage the schema somehow. There are all sorts of cool ways to do it, all sorts of cool products, but we're going to basically talk about the framework or the requirements for what these products need to do in order for us to appropriately integrate it with Chef. So something that we're not going to talk about that did come up is schema consistency. So if you've had a non-automated world where people are logging into databases and updating schema, then you're going to have a big problem of, even if you do have a schema update process that is with Chef, that's consistent, that's at velocity, you're going to have a problem with all your databases being the same and perhaps having failures on some of the databases that aren't on others because of schema inconsistency. And this can be a huge problem. We have identified places where that problem does exist from years of people logging in, and we've decided that we're just not going to look at that as a Chef initiative. Like we're looking at database consistency as a big deal, but we're going to use tools like Redgate. They have a schema comparison. There are other tools out there. We're just going to find the right tool and identify the changes that are needed, and then use this schema update mechanism that I'll talk about in future slides for delivering those changes to the databases. So our schema management strategy is, let's not reinvent the wheel. So I started talking to people in our organization about, hey, let's make this totally awesome Chef thing that does all this stuff, and let's totally change everything. And the database people were basically like, whoa, let's not do that. Okay, they don't necessarily want you to come mess up their world. So my strategy quickly shifted into, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's go with what we have. Let's just make it Chef friendly. We basically need to make whatever you're doing run in Chef, and if it does, you get to keep your thing. It's kind of a keep your plan strategy. So I have to communicate, though, whatever you have today needs to fit these 4 requirements. First, all the changes that you make in the database need to be persisted in the database. And this is kind of a weird idea. And I don't really understand why it's a weird idea, because you would think of all things that would love persistence, it would be the database. It's sort of good at persistence, right? But, storing non-customer data in my database can be a little bit weird. But when you start thinking about it, it fits along with the DevOps principles of whatever you're doing, record it, measure it, understand what's going on. That is going to be the basis of automation. You have to know what your state is, and the best place to store that state is inside the database itself, because if you do a restore, especially when you have thousands of databases like I was describing, when you do a restore, you need to know within that database where it was in its life cycle journey. It needs to know if changes are required. So it's one thing to be able to look at a database and say, these changes have happened to it. And then it's another thing to say, here are the changes that need to happen to it in order to be brought up to speed. And this is kind of the same thing that's happening with anything you do with Chef. You need to be able to know the state of the system and know when changes are needed in the system so that you can build an idempotent workflow. It needs to execute those changes. That's pretty self-explanatory, unless they have a totally awesome user interface that does the update of the schema. So if they have a user interface, they push the run button, that's going to be no bueno. We need to have a command line utility or something like that in order to run these things, so they're going to have to make some changes. And it needs to be accessible through automation, like what I'm saying, is you have to You have to run it inside of Chef. I'm not going to point at the run button for you and click it and pray to God through my computing ways that it will finish. It needs to be a command line application. And by the way, that is a reading rainbow cake that my wife made. We have a deal where when our kids learn how to read, they have a reading rainbow party, and they get a reading rainbow cake, and they learn how to read from that awesome book. If you get anything out of this presentation, this is a little aside, that book is awesome. It goes lesson by lesson and teaches one by one all the sounds, how to read, the whole thing. And my 4-year-old right now, I sit down with him every night and I go through, okay, now this is a sound. You're not supposed to say the letters. That's confusing. This is a sound. Say he does it. And you're reading words, you're reading stories. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this, for one, because that is a confusing slide. It's a reading rainbow cake. But automation is kind of the same way. You've got to go to a team that if you're leading this or you're on a team, whatever, and you got to say, I need to take my process and I need to compose it into different layers. I need to take the pieces and I need to automate them. And I'm here to kind of demystify the database part of that. The database is the same type of thing. I go to this, okay, what's your automation strategy right now? We don't have one. Okay, then let's use something like what I'm getting ready to show you. Or we have this user interface application. Okay, does it fit these requirements? Yes or no? And you just walk through making things a little bit better, a little bit at a time in pieces. So, rather than just tell you a bunch of theory, I wanted to talk through what it would look like to have a database upgrade process using SQL Server, but you can use anything that fits these requirements. So I want to give you a real example. This is available on the supermarket. So if you search for database upgrader, there it will be, version 1.0. It's also available on GitHub. Those are the bit.ly links. If you check my blog a little bit later, I'll post those there as well. But this is basically an example to show you, okay, so how would you do a database schema upgrade process that fits within a Chef environment? And hopefully you'll see it's pretty easy. So first element of it, we have a version table. The version table, this is the needs to be persisted in the database thing, right? We have a version table. It's got an integer database version and a software version, and it tells me when I ran the script. So I can look right into that table and figure out when all my changes were happening. In my source control, along with the code, I have a folder called database scripts. And the folder has a bunch of numbered SQL scripts. And by convention, SQL scripts 34 goes with 435. And you can look at that folder and you can say, okay, what is the database version, the latest database version in the version table? It's version 48. What's the latest script? It's version 52. That means I need to run 49, 50, 51, and 52 in that sequence. So the final bit of the requirement of it being persistent is you need to have some sort of way to add that table to the database. So I have this initialize, requires initialize. You give it a connection string, and it adds with rights to add a table, and it adds the version table and a record in it. Okay, so how does it know if the changes are required? I just sort of described that process. It looks at the folder, looks at the table, compares the two things, and this database upgrader requires upgrade flag will basically tell me it does or does not require an upgrade. And you need this so that you can do your item potency right. You need it as an only if guard on an execute clause, which I show right here. So you run the thing, you give it a connection string, and you tell it the scripts folder, and then you basically execute it with the only if. So that's all well and good. You can have a bunch of execute statement stuff, but we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about something that's totally awesome that kind of doesn't have anything to do with database upgrades, but you'll be happy that you learned about it. It's the resource cookbook. Anybody heard about the resource cookbook? No. Great. Well, cool guy at Chef, John Kaiser. I guess he's speaking tomorrow. He made it, and it's available on GitHub and everything. And it's the easiest way ever to write a resource. So if you've written lightweight resource providers or even heavyweight resource providers, this is even easier than that. So I'm going to show you that in 3 slides. I basically used his resource cookbook in order to wrap this to make it runnable by Chef. So basically, here are the pieces. You've got to declare the cookbook resource as a dependency. You add a checked file in your recipe, or in your cookbook rather. You declare the properties you want at the top, and you can see that one of them is an identity. And then you declare the code that I just showed you in an execute, all the execute resources and stuff inside of a recipe block. And that's it. So then, from there, I can just say database upgrade checked. I give it the connection string, and it handles everything for me. So that is like the easiest way to write resources ever. I got it working in 10 minutes. It was awesome. And that's kind of an optional thing too. If you're just wanting to execute something and not make it reusable or easy, that's fine too. But here we got, you give it a connection string, a scripts directory, and the version that you're running, and then it handles all the rest of it for you. Before you go off and download this and put it in production, I did want to mention a few warnings about this. This is really for an example. So my intention with this is a development team comes to you and says, does our schema management fit requirements for Chef? And you say, well, go look at this thing. This is an example. And here are the requirements that you need to meet. And then they can kind of look at a 100-line piece of .NET code and kind of figure it out for themselves. But a few disclaimers about it. Number one, it is only for SQL Server. So as you can see, it's .NET code writing against SQL Server in that first line there. The other thing is if it fails, you're screwed. So that's not really good for production, but I didn't put a bunch of transactional stuff in there. So please don't go run this in production. It's only for demonstration purposes. So a couple other things that that came up while I was talking to a bunch. I was able to talk to dozens of teams on their database strategy. So a couple of challenges that came up. One challenge was one team needed to make a change, an upgrade on thousands of databases. I keep saying this. Thousands of databases, hundreds of servers. They needed to make that all at once during an outage window, during an upgrade process. So the application layer would only do an upgrade when all the databases were upgraded at once. And we're talking about huge databases, so the upgrade process could have been hours. And so they need to manage that outage window well. And so, what are we going to do with Chef with this? The problem with Chef is that Chef tells you about that a thing is finished and its status, but it doesn't tell you much about while it's running what's happening. And also it doesn't really do multi-threading well, so if you're going to need to do this massive thing all at once, it's really not a natural fit for how Chef is set up. So, I tried to come up with some crazy, awesome solution for managing this problem within Chef, and then I realized, let's just let Chef be good at what it's good at. It will still report back what the status was at the end, and you get that through Chef Analytics and all that stuff. But what's going on during that critical 2 hours of time is going to be up to the existing database schema upgrade process that team has. So that team is going to need to be able to have their application that upgrades the database be kicked off by Chef, and then they're going to be able to need to get reporting from that application itself and not necessarily from Chef for any real-time updates during the massive database upgrade window. So that was a challenge that we had to face, and basically we went back to the strategy, don't reinvent the wheel, you get to keep what you have. Let's just make Chef good at what Chef's good at, and let's do everything else the way we've been doing it as much as possible. Another challenge that they had that a friend of mine, Mike, has on an application where they do dozens of schema updates a month. Basically, this is the application that houses all the configuration database for our store products. So as you can imagine, every upgrade of every one of our products running inside of a restaurant goes through this one database. They're going to have a lot of schema changes. And they've decided to split off what they call internal versus external changes. So they have one way of doing internal changes to where they have the super secret way. They have probably scripts just like this. But they have their non-published way. And then when they go to publish it at the end of their release, they will gather all those together into one and ship that, and customers or external people will only be able to go from one external version to another external version. So that's kind of a more complicated version management strategy where you can do internal versus external changes. So that's basically schema management. I showed you the requirements. I showed you a basic application. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with schema management, like declarative tables and stuff. Didn't really see very great tools on that. If you guys want to share those with me, that would be awesome. But basically for us is let's keep doing what we've been doing. Configuration is even less interesting. Those are the three examples that I found, like how much memory are you going to have SQL Server running in? What is your engine configuration? Most people don't do anything with engine configuration. If you do, Chef's a natural place to do that in. But that's basically how we track the 4 issues. And before I wrap up, though, I want to talk about how do we talk to DBAs. And this is kind of a journey I've been on for the last year or so. Because DBAs are kind of seen as not wanting to use Chef stuff. They want to have their own world. They want to be siphoned off from the rest of us. And that's probably why we don't hear much in the Chef community about databases, because frankly, they're not the first people to be jumping in line to accept this technology. But I found DBAs, at least within our organization, to be allies, very natural allies to what I'm trying to do. And it's just a matter of how I'm going to frame what we're trying to accomplish. And it's a matter of also telling them that I understand the things that they are better at within the infrastructure than the application layer people, and sort of talking about how we're creating a partnership more than just coming in and saying, I'm doing all this cool stuff, and you're behind the times, kind of a threat type of deal. So the strategy matters when you're talking to database people, and these are the things that I found to be effective. By the way, that's a picture of Prague from the clock tower, and Prague is totally beautiful when you go to Europe. If you ever want to go to Prague, it's awesome. But it also reminded me of nodes in a data center for some reason. So strategy matters when you're talking to a DBA. You tell them basically that there are other nodes in your environment that you've been sick and tired of hammering your database in an inconsistent way. Somebody slams something into production and it causes chaos, and you don't know what happened, and these crazy developers are doing all this crazy stuff to production, and it ruins your beautiful, sane database world. And we're going to change that. The other nodes are going to get better. I think that database people have been forced to accept automation a lot sooner than a lot of us have been in the application or other operations worlds. And that's an important thing to validate in a conversation. Like, you have been doing automation with your backup. You have been doing automation with all this other stuff. The other nodes are going to be doing just as much automation as you've been doing all this time. The other problem I've come across that they have is I just can't get a realistic pre-production infrastructure. And this is probably, to me, the strongest selling point for for making an ally of a DBA with Chef. And basically, it's you have been running a very non-realistic environment. Usually, the database people in pre-production or in a QA environment, and we're going to be able to make it so that you can run a way more realistic environment. And that upgrade that scares you, that schema upgrade because you don't have the right amount of data to know whether it's going to succeed or take a long time or whatever, let's make that a little less scary by replicating that environment easily in a pre-production environment. And that's something that gets them really excited. Also, the cattle not pets thing, which I know you guys aren't from Texas, but this doesn't really translate in Texas because I was telling my colleagues that they, you name your pets, you don't name your cattle. And a lady on my team was saying that grew up on a farm. She was saying, "We name our cattle," and I said, "Well, do you slaughter them too?" "Yeah, we slaughter them too." So don't use this in Texas, but the metaphor still works, right? So if they know their three servers, Joe, Paul, and Stephen, by name, and they know their little quirks, but we're going to be able to let them add another one a lot quicker. So they're not going to have to worry about basically, the fear of growth. And finally, this is back to the validation thing. It's really important to validate to DBAs what they're already good at and what they're better at, frankly, than the rest of us. And that's automation. They're really great at automation. And we're saying, you've been great at automation. You felt like you've been on this silo of awesomeness and automation and that everybody else is not disciplined. Well, we're going to come in and we're going to make everybody else disciplined. And we're going to basically bring everyone up to the level that you've been at. We just need for you to cooperate, basically, is the way I've approached it. So I had an epiphany with the snowflake thing. I got frustrated, but now I know what it was all about. Chef is the framework that allows you to take any bit of your infrastructure, including the database, and integrate it all together, take the automation that you already have or create new automation, and bring it all together into a snowflake. When the salespeople were talking to me about everybody's a snowflake, they weren't saying, we haven't solved this problem or nobody solved this problem. They were saying, don't reinvent the wheel. Go into the infrastructure that you already have, find the places where the automation is already at, and integrate the automation together as Chef as a delivery. That's basically what they were saying. And now that I understand that, I am much better. I'm much happier about the snowflake analogy. It's really basically empowering me within the organization to create custom solutions. And that's basically what software is. That's what we're doing with everything. So hopefully this is the beginning of discussions about databases. Some of you may have thought this is very basic and you already knew it. If that's true, I encourage you to talk about it, even with me after this. I think we just need to talk about what patterns everyone's using and then have more than just, everybody does their own thing, because I think that this is something that we need to build on and create a best practices within our industry of how we're dealing with databases. Hopefully I've started that, but I definitely don't think it's the end. Thanks, guys, for your time.